It was a calm and sunny afternoon in the neighborhood. The street was quiet, birds were singing, children were riding their bikes. Everything looked peaceful and normal. Nothing felt strange or dangerous. Inside her house, Mrs. Karen Lewis stood near her living room window. She held her coffee cup tightly in her hand. Her eyes were fixed on the house across the street. A new man had moved in 3 days ago. His name was Marcus Johnson. But she did not know that yet. She had never spoken to him. She had only watched him from a distance. Marcus was carrying large brown boxes from a truck into his garage. He worked quietly and quickly. He did not smile, he did not wave, he just moved back and forth, lifting heavy boxes, closing his trunk and walking inside his house. To anyone else, it looked normal, a man moving into his new home. But inside Mrs. Lewis's mind, something felt wrong. She had noticed him arriving late at night on the first day. She had seen him receive several packages the next morning. She had watched him walk around his backyard while talking on his phone. Each small action built a story in her mind. A story she created without knowing the truth. Why does he move so quietly? She whispered to herself. Why so many boxes? Her heart began to beat faster. Fear slowly grew inside her. It was not based on facts. It was based on imagination. She walked back and forth across her living room, trying to calm herself, but every time she looked outside, she saw Marcus lifting another box. What if something bad is happening? She thought. She picked up her phone, put it down, picked it up again. Her hands were shaking. Finally, she dialed the number for the authorities. The phone rang once, twice. A calm voice answered. How can we help you? Mrs. Lewis took a deep breath. I want to report something suspicious, she said. Her voice sounded nervous but serious. There is a man across the street. He just moved in. He is acting strange. I feel unsafe. The operator asked simple questions. What exactly is he doing? He keeps bringing in boxes. He moves late at night. I don't know what is inside those packages, she replied. The operator paused for a moment. Ma'am, moving boxes is normal when someone moves into a new home. I know, she said quickly. But something feels wrong. Please send someone. There was silence for a few seconds. Then the operator said, Officers are on the way. Mrs. Lewis ended the call and stood frozen near the window. Her stomach felt tight. She felt both relieved and nervous at the same time. Across the street, Marcus wiped sweat from his forehead. He had almost finished unloading the truck. He looked tired but focused. He had no idea that someone had just called the authorities on him. 5 minutes later, the sound of sirens broke the peaceful afternoon. The children stopped riding their bikes. Neighbors stepped outside their homes. Curtains moved as people looked through windows. 2 police cars turned onto the street, red and blue lights flashing brightly. Mrs. Lewis felt her heart jump into her throat. They're here, she whispered. The police cars stopped directly in front of Marcus's house. Marcus looked confused. He slowly placed the box on the ground. His eyes moved from one officer to the other. 2 officers stepped out of their cars. Calm but serious. Sir, one officer called out. Can we speak with you for a moment? Marcus raised his hands slowly, not because he had done something wrong, but because he did not want any trouble. Yes, officer, he said quietly. Neighbors began whispering to each other. What happened? Did he do something? I knew something felt strange. Mrs. Lewis watched everything from behind her curtain. Her breathing was fast. Part of her expected the officers to run inside the house. Part of her expected something dramatic. But all she saw was Marcus standing there, looking confused and calm. The officer asked him a simple question. Do you live here? Yes, I just moved in, Marcus answered. Can we see your identification? Marcus nodded and slowly walked inside his house to get his ID. The entire street felt tense. The peaceful afternoon was gone. When Marcus returned and handed over his ID, the officers studied it carefully. Mrs. Lewis held her breath, waiting. She did not know that in just a few minutes, she would learn something that would make her question everything she believed. The flashing lights continued to shine across the houses, and the call she had made, the call she believed would protect her, was about to change her life in a way she never expected. Marcus Johnson stood quietly in front of the officers. The red and blue lights flashed across his face. The whole street was watching him. He felt every eye on him, but he kept his voice calm. "Yes, officer. I just moved here 3 days ago," he said. He handed over his identification with steady hands. He did not argue. He did not shout, even though his heart was beating fast. The officer looked at the card carefully, then looked at Marcus again. "And what were you doing just now?" the officer asked. "Unpacking boxes from my truck," Marcus replied. "I am almost done." The second officer looked toward the open garage. Brown boxes were stacked neatly inside. Some were labeled kitchen. Some said books. Others said medical supplies. Nothing looked strange. Still, the tension in the air was heavy. Across the street, Mrs. Lewis stood behind her curtain. Her fingers pressed against the fabric. She wanted to see everything. She wanted proof that she was right. In her mind, she had already decided who Marcus was. She saw him as secretive, quiet, suspicious, but she did not know his story. Marcus had moved to this neighborhood because he wanted peace. He had spent the last few years living close to the hospital where he worked. The city had been loud and stressful, sirens every night, long shifts, emergency calls. He had promised himself that if he ever saved enough money, he would move somewhere quiet, somewhere calm, somewhere he could finally rest. This neighborhood looked perfect: clean streets, friendly houses, children playing outside. He had smiled when he signed the papers. He had felt hopeful. Now that hope felt fragile. "Is there a problem, officer?" Marcus asked politely. The first officer cleared his throat. "We received a call from someone who said your behavior seemed suspicious." Marcus blinked, confused. "Suspicious?" he repeated softly. "Yes. They said you were moving boxes late at night and bringing in many packages." Marcus almost laughed, but he stopped himself. This was serious. "I work late shifts sometimes," he explained, "and I ordered some equipment for work." The officers looked at each other. "What kind of equipment?" the second officer asked. "Medical equipment," Marcus answered. "I am setting up a small home office." The word medical floated in the air. The first officer narrowed his eyes slightly, not in anger, but in curiosity. "You work in medicine?" he asked. "Yes," Marcus nodded. "I work at City Hospital." At that moment, one of the neighbors stepped closer to hear better. Another neighbor whispered something under her breath. Mrs. Lewis felt her stomach twist. Medical equipment, City Hospital. She had not expected that. The first officer studied Marcus carefully. "Full name?" he asked. "Marcus Allen Johnson." The officer's expression changed slowly. Recognition appeared on his face. "Wait," he said quietly. "Are you the same Dr. Johnson who was on the news last week?" Marcus looked surprised. "I do not know, maybe," he said softly. The officer turned to his partner. "He was the one who stayed during the storm. Remember, when half the staff could not make it?" The second officer's eyes widened. "That was you?" he asked Marcus. Marcus shifted slightly, feeling uncomfortable with the attention. "Yes, I stayed because patients needed help," he replied simply. There was no pride in his voice, no need to impress anyone, just a quiet statement of fact. The tension in the street began to change. Neighbors who had been whispering now looked at each other with surprise. One older woman gasped softly. "He saved my sister," she whispered. Mrs. Lewis felt heat rise to her face. Saved someone, stayed during the storm. She remembered that night clearly. The power had gone out. The rain had been heavy. Ambulances had been moving all night. The news had shown doctors working without rest. She had felt thankful for those doctors. She had called them heroes. And now, the man she had feared was one of them. Marcus stood quietly while the officers spoke in low voices. The flashing lights still reflected on the houses, but they no longer felt dramatic. They felt misplaced. "Sir," the first officer said respectfully, "I apologize for the misunderstanding. We had to respond to the call." "I understand," Marcus replied calmly. But even though he sounded calm, something inside him felt heavy. Being questioned in front of everyone hurt. Being seen as dangerous without reason hurt even more. Across the street, Mrs. Lewis slowly lowered her curtain. Her breathing felt different now, not fast with fear, but tight with regret. She realized she had never walked across the street to say hello, never offered a welcome, never asked his name. She had only watched from a distance and believed her own fear. Outside, the officers were already stepping back toward their cars. The neighbors were slowly returning to their homes. But nothing. The police cars did not leave right away. The red and blue lights were still flashing. But the sound of sirens had stopped. The street felt strangely quiet, like it was holding its breath. Marcus stood near his garage, his hands now resting at his sides. He was no longer being questioned harshly, but the eyes of the neighborhood were still on him. That feeling did not go away easily. The first officer spoke again. This time his tone was softer. "Dr. Johnson, we truly apologize for the inconvenience," he said. "We had to check. That is our duty." Marcus nodded slowly. "I understand. You were doing your job." His voice was calm, but inside, something felt unsettled. Across the street, Mrs. Lewis stepped away from the window. Her heart felt heavy. She had expected danger. She had expected drama, but instead she found herself facing something much harder, the truth. Outside, one brave neighbor finally spoke. "Doctor, were you really the one who helped during the storm?" An older man asked carefully. Marcus hesitated. He did not like attention, but he answered honestly, "Yes. Many of us stayed at the hospital that night," he said. "Patients needed care." The older man nodded slowly. His expression changed from suspicion to respect. "My nephew was there," he said quietly. "He survived because of doctors like you." A small murmur spread through the small crowd. People who had stepped outside out of curiosity were now standing in silence, processing what they had just witnessed. Mrs. Lewis could not stay inside any longer. The weight in her chest pushed her toward the door. She opened it slowly and stepped outside. The sunlight felt different now, almost too bright. As she walked down her driveway, she could hear her own footsteps louder than usual. Every step felt heavy. The officers noticed her approaching. "Ma'am," one officer said gently, "is there anything else you would like to add?" Her mouth felt dry. Words seemed hard to form. She looked at Marcus for the first time without the safety of her window between them. He did not look dangerous. He did not look suspicious. He looked tired, embarrassed, human. I thought something was wrong," she said softly, her voice shaking. Marcus met her eyes, not with anger, but with quiet sadness. "What did you think was wrong?" he asked calmly. The question hit her harder than she expected. She realized she did not have a real answer. "I saw you moving boxes late at night," she said weakly. "I saw packages." Marcus nodded slightly. "I work long shifts," he replied. "Sometimes I get home after midnight. The packages were supplies for my patients." The word patients made her stomach twist again. The second officer spoke gently. "Ma'am, nothing illegal is happening here." The truth hung in the air, clear and simple. Mrs. Lewis felt the eyes of her neighbors on her now. The same eyes that had been watching Marcus minutes ago were now watching her. She felt small. For the first time, she understood how exposed Marcus must have felt standing there. The flashing lights suddenly seemed unnecessary, loud, almost accusing. The first officer turned off the lights on the police car. The street instantly felt calmer. "Dr. Johnson, you are free to continue your day," the officer said respectfully. Marcus nodded. "Thank you, officers." The police cars slowly drove away, leaving behind silence. But the silence was not peaceful, it was thoughtful. One by one, neighbors began returning to their homes. Some gave Marcus small nods of apology. Others avoided eye contact. Mrs. Lewis remained standing in the middle of her driveway, unsure what to do next. Marcus picked up the box he had set down earlier. He carried it into his garage. Then he paused. He turned back toward her. "You could have just knocked," he said gently. Not angry, not loud, just honest. Those simple words felt heavier than any accusation. Mrs. Lewis felt her throat tighten. She had chosen fear instead of conversation, distance instead of kindness. "I'm sorry," she whispered. But the words felt too small. Marcus studied her for a moment. Then he gave a small nod. "I hope we can start over," he said quietly. There was no bitterness in his voice, only tired hope. He turned and walked back inside his house, closing the garage slowly behind him. The street returned to normal sounds, birds chirping, a car passing by in the distance, a child laughing somewhere far down the block. But inside Mrs. Lewis, nothing felt normal. She walked back toward her house slowly, her mind replaying everything that had happened. The flashing lights, the whispers, the officer's voice saying "Doctor." The look in Marcus's eyes. She realized something important in that moment. Fear had created a story in her mind, but truth had erased it in seconds. And now she was left with the uncomfortable space between who she thought she was and what she had done. Inside his house, Marcus leaned. That evening, the street looked calm again. The police cars were gone. The neighbors were inside their homes. The sky slowly turned orange as the sun began to set. But inside Mrs. Lewis's house, nothing felt calm. She sat alone at her kitchen table, her untouched dinner in front of her, her mind replaying every second of the afternoon. "Dr. Johnson." The words echoed again and again in her head. She turned on the television almost without thinking. The local news channel was still talking about the big storm from last week. Images of flooded streets and broken power lines appeared on the screen. Then she saw a familiar face. Marcus. He was standing inside the hospital hallway, wearing blue medical scrubs, a tired but gentle expression on his face. The news reporter's voice spoke clearly. One of the doctors who stayed for 36 hours straight during the storm was Dr. Marcus Johnson. Mrs. Lewis froze. The reporter continued. While many roads were closed and staff could not reach the hospital, Dr. Johnson refused to leave. He helped deliver a baby during a power outage and performed emergency surgery with limited equipment. The image showed Marcus comforting a crying child in a hospital bed. Mrs. Lewis felt her eyes fill with tears. This was the man she had reported, the man she thought was suspicious, the man she believed was dangerous. And now she was watching him being called a hero. On the television, the reporter asked Marcus a question. "Doctor, why did you choose to stay when others were told it was unsafe?" Marcus smiled softly. "Because someone needed to," he answered simply. No pride, no anger, just a simple answer. Mrs. Lewis covered her mouth with her hand. Her chest felt tight, not with fear this time, but with shame. At that same moment, across the street, Marcus was sitting in his small home office, unpacking one of the boxes labeled medical supplies. Inside were simple items, bandages, gloves, blood pressure equipment. He carefully placed them on shelves, setting up a small space where he could help patients online during his days off. He had planned to offer free health advice to elderly people in the neighborhood. He did not tell anyone yet. He wanted it to be a quiet surprise, but the events of the afternoon still weighed on him. He remembered the looks from the neighbors, the flashing lights, the whispers. Even though the officers had apologized, the feeling of being judged without being known stayed in his heart. He sat down in his chair and closed his eyes for a moment. He had seen pain in many forms at the hospital, but this kind of pain was silent. It did not leave bruises, it did not show on X-rays. It simply sat inside. Across the street, Mrs. Lewis turned off the television slowly. The house felt too quiet. She walked to her living room window again. But this time she did not hide behind the curtain. She stood openly, looking at Marcus's house. A light was on inside his office. She could see him moving around, placing things on shelves. He looked peaceful, focused, not dangerous, not suspicious, just a man living his life. Her phone buzzed suddenly. It was a message from her friend. "Did you hear about the doctor who moved into your street?" The message read. Mrs. Lewis felt her stomach drop. Her friend continued, "He saved my cousin during the storm. We were so grateful. You're lucky to have someone like that in your neighborhood." Lucky. The word hit her harder than anything else. Lucky. Instead of feeling lucky, she had felt afraid. Instead of welcoming him, she had called the authorities. Tears slowly rolled down her cheeks. She realized something painful. Her fear had not come from anything Marcus had done. It had come from her own assumptions. She had built a story in her mind without facts, without conversation, without courage, and now the truth was shining bright, too bright to ignore. Outside, a soft knock echoed through her thoughts. It was not at her door, it was at her conscience. She knew she could not sleep without doing something. Across the street, Marcus stepped outside onto his small front porch. He needed fresh air. The evening breeze felt cool against his face. He looked up at the sky, watching the last light of the sun disappear. He wondered if he had made the right choice moving here. He wanted a fresh start, a peaceful place. Instead, his first week had ended with police lights. But he also believed in second chances. Inside her house, Mrs. Lewis stood up slowly. She walked to her kitchen counter and opened a drawer. She took out a small notepad. Her hand trembled as she began to write. "I am sorry." She stared at the words. They felt too small for the mistake she had made. Across the street, Marcus leaned against his porch railing, thinking about the long day at the hospital tomorrow. He did not know that at this very moment, the woman who had doubted him was finally see. The next morning felt different. The sun rose slowly over the quiet street. The air was fresh, birds sang like nothing had happened. But inside two houses, hearts were still heavy. Mrs. Lewis had barely slept. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the flashing police lights. She heard her own voice saying the words suspicious and unsafe. She saw Marcus standing in front of the officers, calm but exposed. She got out of bed early and walked to her kitchen. The house felt too quiet. She looked out the window again. But this time she did not feel fear. She felt regret. Across the street, Marcus was already awake. He wore a clean shirt and prepared to leave for work. His movements were slow, not because he was tired, but because his thoughts were heavy. He remembered the whispers, the neighbors watching, the feeling of being judged before being known. He had experienced moments like this before in his life, moments where people looked at him and decided who he was without asking. He had learned to stay calm, to stay patient, to stay kind, but that did not mean it did not hurt. He picked up his car keys and stepped outside. The morning light touched his face. He noticed the curtains in Mrs. Lewis's house move slightly. He knew she was watching. For a brief second, their eyes met across the street. This time, she did not hide. She opened her front door slowly and stepped outside. Her heart was beating fast again, but not from fear, from courage. "Dr. Johnson," she called softly. Marcus paused near his car. He turned toward her. "Yes," he replied calmly. She walked a few steps forward, then stopped. The distance between them felt larger than the street itself. "I saw the news last night," she said quietly. Marcus said nothing, he simply listened. "I did not know," she continued, her voice shaking. "I did not know who you were, what you had done." Marcus looked at her gently. "You could have asked," he said softly. The words were not sharp, they were honest. Mrs. Lewis felt her throat tighten again. "You are right," she admitted. "I should have asked." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence was not angry. It was thoughtful. "I made a mistake," she said finally. "I let fear control me." Marcus studied her face. He could see that her words were real. He could see the embarrassment in her eyes. "I am not angry," he said slowly. "But it is not easy to stand in front of your own home while people look at you like you do not belong." His words were calm, but they carried truth. Mrs. Lewis nodded slowly. "I understand that now," she whispered. In that moment, she truly did. She imagined how she would feel if police cars stopped in front of her house for no reason, if neighbors whispered about her, if someone judged her without knowing her. The thought made her chest ache. "I am sorry," she said again, this time stronger. Marcus took a deep breath. He looked down at his car keys, then back at her. "I moved here for peace," he said quietly. "I wanted a place where I could rest after long days at the hospital." She nodded. And I turned your peace into something else, she said, tears forming in her eyes. Marcus gave a small, tired smile. Peace can be rebuilt, he said. But trust takes time. Those words stayed with her. Trust takes time. As Marcus opened his car door, Mrs. Lewis spoke again. Can I do something to make this right? She asked. Marcus paused, thinking carefully. Start by getting to know me, he said simply. Not as a headline, not as a rumor, just as a neighbor. He got into his car and drove away slowly. Mrs. Lewis stood in the driveway long after his car disappeared. She realized that forgiveness was not automatic. It was a process. Inside her house, she walked to the kitchen again. Her eyes landed on a small recipe book on the counter. She opened it slowly, turning the pages with new determination. Across town, Marcus arrived at the hospital. Nurses greeted him warmly. Patients smiled when they saw him. Good morning, Dr. Johnson, a nurse said kindly. Good morning. He replied with a soft smile. Here, he was not a suspect, not a stranger. He was trusted, needed, respected. But even as he moved through the busy hospital halls, part of his mind remained on the quiet street he had chosen as his new home. He wondered if things could truly change. Back in the neighborhood, Mrs. Lewis finished baking a small batch of cookies. Her hands were steadier now, her decision was clear. She placed the cookies carefully into a box. It was a small gesture, but for her, it meant something bigger. It meant she was choosing courage over fear. She looked out the window one more time, waiting for Marcus to return from work. The weight of her mistake still sat in her heart. But for the first time since she made that call, she felt ready to face it, because the real lesson was not just about one phone call. It was about understanding that fear. The sun was beginning to set when Marcus finally returned home. The sky was painted in soft orange and pink. The neighborhood looked peaceful again, almost like the street was trying to forget what had happened 2 days before. Marcus parked his car slowly and turned off the engine. He sat there for a moment, looking at the houses around him. He wanted this place to feel like home, but something still felt fragile. Across the street, Mrs. Lewis saw his car lights turn off. Her heart began to race again. The box of cookies sat on her kitchen counter, wrapped carefully in clean paper. She had written a small note and placed it inside. She stared at the box for a long moment. Doubt whispered in her mind. What if he refuses? What if he does not forgive me? What if it is too late? But another voice inside her spoke louder. You have to try. She picked up the box and walked toward her front door. Each step felt heavy, but she did not stop. Outside, Marcus stepped out of his car. He looked tired from his long shift. He carried a small folder under his arm. His shoulders slightly bent from the weight of the day. He noticed movement from across the street. Mrs. Lewis was walking toward him, slowly, carefully, like someone walking toward a difficult truth. Marcus watched her approach, his expression calm but cautious. When she reached his driveway, she stopped for a second, then forced herself to continue. Dr. Johnson, she said softly. Marcus nodded. Good evening. Her hands were shaking slightly as she held out the box. I made these for you, she said. It is not much, but I wanted to do something. Marcus looked at the box, then at her face. He could see how hard this moment was for her. You did not have to, he said gently. I know, she replied, but I wanted to. There was silence for a few seconds. The air between them no longer felt tense, but it still felt careful. I also wrote something, she added quietly. It is inside. Marcus accepted the box slowly. Thank you, he said, but she did not leave. There is something else, she continued, her voice almost breaking. I have been thinking about why I reacted the way I did. Marcus listened without interrupting. I told myself it was about safety, she said. But the truth is, it was about fear. Fear of what I did not know. Fear of someone different from me. And that fear made me unfair. Marcus looked at her closely. These were not easy words to say. Fear can be powerful, he said quietly. Yes, she nodded. But it can also be wrong. She took a deep breath. I judged you without knowing you. I made you feel like you did not belong here, and that was not right. The honesty in her voice felt real, not forced, not rushed. Marcus shifted slightly. Do you know what hurt the most? He asked softly. She shook her head. It was not the police, he said. It was knowing that my neighbor saw me as a threat before seeing me as a person. Those words settled heavily between them. Mrs. Lewis felt tears form again, but she did not look away this time. I am trying to change that, she said firmly. Marcus studied her face, looking for signs of pride or excuse, but he saw only regret and effort. Change does not happen in one conversation, he said honestly. I know, she replied, but I am willing to learn. For the first time since the incident, Marcus felt something shift inside him, not complete forgiveness, but the beginning of understanding. He opened the cookie box slightly and smiled faintly. They look good, he said. She let out a small nervous laugh. My grandmother's recipe, she explained. Then they must be special, Marcus replied. The moment felt lighter, but still meaningful. Would you like to come in for tea? Marcus asked after a pause. Mrs. Lewis looked surprised. Are you sure? She asked. Yes, he nodded. If we are starting over, we should start properly. She stepped inside his home for the first time, not as someone watching from behind a curtain, but as a neighbor. Inside, the house was simple and neat. Books lined the shelves. Medical equipment was arranged carefully in one corner. Family photos rested on a small table. Mrs. Lewis noticed a photo of Marcus standing beside an elderly woman, both smiling warmly. My mother, Marcus said gently when he saw her looking. She taught me to stay calm even when people misunderstand you. Mrs. Lewis nodded slowly. She raised you well, she said sincerely. They sat at the kitchen table with simple cups of tea. The conversation was not dramatic. It was simple, honest, human. They talked about work, about the storm, about the neighborhood. With each word, the wall between them grew thinner. Outside, the street remained quiet, unaware that something important was happening inside that house. Because sometimes the biggest change does not come from flashing lights or loud voices. It comes from a single knock on a door, and the core.